So continuing with the discussion of unification theories, I sort of want to try and come up with a systematic way of understanding human behavior, and that includes everything from psychological social behavior to physiological behavior. And so when I say physiological behavior, I mean, what does a person's body present itself as? So somebody's physiological behavior is their phenotype, right? Their essence is their genotype. And then their physiological behavior would be their phenotype. Are they skinny? Are they thick? Are they strong? Are they weak? Flexible? Stiff? Are they suffering? Is their metabolism robust and healthy, or do they suffer from metabolic syndrome? Are they host to parasites, or is their body pure? Right. So there's different levels of human behavior, and they're interlinked. And so to sort of understand this, and the reason I started contemplating this was because it's like, obviously we're kind of engaging with a strange form of totalitarian behavior and a strange form of groupthink, especially among people who really used to criticize groupthink. Like, a lot of people into various forms of counterculture and free thought and individuality, who felt sort of stifled or suppressed by the man, you know, hippies and stuff like that, punk, hipsters, queer people. You know, suddenly all of these people are engaging in what looks like an obvious and absurd level of groupthink and complete trust and obedience towards, quote unquote, the man. And when I say the man, I mean, you know, specific central authorities and corporations who have dominated and betrayed them and lied to them, you know, repeatedly throughout history. And this domination and this lying is what originally spawned the counterculture. So it's very strange that everyone is suddenly like sort of in this lockstep groupthink. So what's going on here is that, and I'll start with like a physical sort of exercise metaphor to map this out in sort of basic terms. You have an inner, and there's an inner body and an outer body. And so the inner body, or the inner being, is like the heart of something. And so in physical exercise, that's the spine, or the axial skeleton. So the head, the vertebrae, the ribs, and the pelvis is kind of like the inner self. And then the outer self would be the limb positions. Right? So within the inner self is just this massive thing that we would call the trunk. Like, it's just sort of one solid object, but inside of that object there's something like 33 articulating vertebrae-ish. Maybe less than 33 articulating vertebrae, but there's about 33 vertebrae. Vertebra. And then all of, like, so that's an incredibly complex system, right? So if you injure the axial skeleton and the axial, like, musculoskeletal system, the effect on athletic performance is catastrophic. You'll either stop getting better, you'll lose coordination, you'll lose strength, and it'll be like, oh yeah, my legs are weak, Like I can't squat as much, or I can't run as far, or I can't throw as hard, or like every time I throw, my shoulder hurts. All these different things are from injury to the inner self, like an injury to the spine. And then once that injury happens, then all of the movements on the outside become sort of broken, no matter what the form is, no matter what the relationship of the limb is to the body itself has become injured. And so that injury can be through like, a joint got hurt, or it can be a neurological injury to where a person stops feeling or stops using or stops recruiting the deep musculature somewhere along the spine. It stops participating in movement. And so then that comes to this thing to where you've got this inside self which is often injured, locked up, non-moving, and in some sort of spasm or in some sort of pathological state. And then you have the limb movement on top of that. So you have the inner and outer self. So if the inner self is injured, there's no progression that can happen in the outer self that happens in that like natural or healthy way. And so the same is true with all the systems of the body. There's an inner heart and there's an outer heart. So if the inner heart is injured via lying or dishonesty or some sort of like emotional separation or detachment from reality, some sort of disassociation, then suddenly an ego is created, and an ego is the outer heart, the outer self. And so that outer self is concerned with social integration, self-pleasure, getting what it wants. And all of these things are good if there's no separation between the inner and the outer self. But if there's a separation between the inner and the outer self, again, all of the things that a person might desire are sitting on top of a pathological core. And that's that path. Like, so if there's a separation between the inner self and the outer self, which also looks like if there's a separation between the self and other people, if there's separation happening, then that means that the inner heart is frozen or in spasm or damaged or not working correctly, and that's identical to having a back injury. Where it's like if you hurt your back, like all limb movement is destroyed. So if you hurt your heart, the entire personality becomes broken. Like the entirety of the personality becomes broken in comparison to an uninjured state. And this uninjured state, like of the inner self, is what people call talent. So if somebody has an uninjured inner state, they just move correctly because they move with coherence and completeness, using their inner being, their core, their spine, right? And this even goes deeper than that. These are almost just graspable metaphors. And then if somebody trains or exercises or practices with their inner self intact and their inner self participating, with their core muscles, their spine recruited correctly, they will get stronger, better, faster. If somebody starts training with a injured inner self, their training won't go anywhere, or they'll hurt themselves. They'll get some weird muscular imbalance, or they'll just plateau or something like that. If anybody is not developing and increasing their potential at their activity, it's because there's been an injury or a separation between their inner and outer self. There's inner and outer musculature, and then there's the inner and the outer heart. The inner and the outer heart is the personality. So anything that a person might desire with a broken inner heart. So if there's any part of the life that's based on a lie or deception, or treating somebody else as less than, So if you're scapegoating anybody, if you're villainizing other people, etc., then the inner, any sort of judgment, like any of those like kind of like at this point cliche Christian values, those are indications of if those aren't being followed, if those precepts of like even of Christianity, of Buddhism, of the authentic paths are not being followed, then that's indicative of a broken inner heart. Ultimately a separation from God, but that separation from God is a separation from all people, and it's even a separation from the self. And so that separation from the self is that situation where you have an inner self and an outer self. And then that outer self is the ego. And then anything that outer self does while that separation is intact, nothing that it does is correct. And so the same thing happens in the mind, like not the heart and the mind. The mind has an inner self, and that inner self is a kind of a no mind, a beginner's mind, like a lack of it's a freedom from the realm of ideas. It's the mind is not separate from reality. So the mind is based on reality. It's based on phenomenon. It uses phenomenon and goes into phenomenon to create concepts. It doesn't go into phenomena with concepts. So if the mind becomes separate from reality, then you have an inner world and an outer world, basically, intellectually. And so what that does is that creates a broken inner self, and then that creates a conceptual net of belief, like sort of a shell or a boundary of belief. And on that shell or that boundary, computations and calculations are like sort of executed, so that the mind stops being an interface with reality and then starts simulating reality when it becomes broken. When the mind makes an idol of its ideas and stops worshiping God, stops worshiping truth, goodness, beauty, and truth. If the mind separates from that and tries to go after power, then it disconnects from reality and becomes a simulation rather than an interface. Like the mind is in its healthy state is a portal into reality, and then in its damaged or disassociated state where the inside is separated from the outside, the inside becomes damaged, and then the outside becomes a compensation mechanism of correct belief, right? So and then if the body is damaged, the inside becomes damaged, and then the outside becomes a compensation mechanism of correct technique. If the heart is damaged, then the inside becomes damaged, and the outer heart becomes the compensation mechanism of fulfillment of desire, correct desire. So it's these schisms between the inside and the outside, and then I think like in the core, or in the metabolic body, the life body, I've never lost metabolic control. Like a lot of this stuff I only know because of like injury to myself that I've had to recover from. So I've like hurt my back and my musculoskeletal system and my heart and my mind, and I've lost control of all those things, and then I've regained control. So I kind of understand that process. I've never lost control of myself metabolically. So I don't know what that's like, but I assume it's somewhat similar. It's likely losing connect. It's probably related to. I actually have done that, and it's probably substance abuse. So substance abuse is a disassociation from the body. So that substance it can be drugs. So that substance can be food, and then there's an injured or a disassociated injured self, and then there's an external desire for substance. I guess materiality. So that could be everything from food to drugs to possessions, to where there's an inner self, and then there's an outside thing that is sought, and then that outside thing that is sought eventually, like, it warps. It's like you seek that over truth or over life, and then the body stops looking alive and it starts looking or acting like the thing that is sought. So you look like the substances that you use for a drug in a way. So like psychedelics would make you look like kind of broken down and deconstructed, since they're all mycelial based for the most part, or animalistic, or like they're like they'll make you more nature-y, sort of. Food will make you obviously bigger. Money will make you like kind of probably shallow or ephemeral or non-participatory, possibly. Possessions will make you look like whatever. So there's that. So when people have these splits, I think with this totalitarian behavior, it's like this is. People fall into these totalitarian traps as it's a mental disorder from a split between the inside and the outside of the self. So it's likely a combination of a heart disassociation, so an injured inner heart, creating a very strong external ego, right? So it seems like a lot of this comes from spiritual communities that tended to create spiritualized egos. So I'm noticing that the totalitarian behavior is actually strongest in people with ego obsession or ego infatuation. So it's like the people that are incredibly into their identity, incredibly into their sexuality, or incredibly into like a spiritual identity or an ego or something. Like everyone that was into their identity seems to be turning very totalitarian. And then also I think there's like mental injuries have happened to where people don't know how to, for lack of a better, they don't know how to pray, so they've created mental idols, and then they're virtually simulating the world. So I think when you have that combination happen in its fullness, when you get like a fully blossoming ego and then a full mental disassociation from reality, right? So you got everyone on the screens, their worldview is informed entirely through this flood of conceptual information coming in through the screens that's informing their sort of the virtual reality that their injured mind is creating. And then within that virtual reality, you have their damaged heart. So their ego is sort of maniacally trying to influence or alter the virtual reality. And I think when that happens, so if you get people believing a bunch of lies, which can cause the virtual reality. Any sort of like like a lie is interesting, but the thing that would cause the virtual reality the most is if somebody started to believe like a play was real, that a false narrative was real. So like if somebody was pretending to be a character that they're not, if you believe that character is true, then suddenly you're in a virtual reality. The virtual reality is not precipitated by false information. Like you kind of see that. The virtual reality and the mental disassociation is created by the belief in false people. It's like it's created by the belief in false characters. So you have basically like a belief in a false drama plus a belief in a false self, I think de facto results in totalitarian mental neurosis, to where you start trying to control reality in a very contrived or stupid way. So from the outside, it starts to look like absolutely stupid, insane, but it makes sense to the totalitarian the same way that like a homeless schizophrenic person walking down the street, like yelling at voices in their head, is internally coherent with themselves. Like the schizophrenia that they're suffering from makes their psychotic behavior seem normal to themselves. And I think that's the same thing with these totalitarian movements that seem to spring up. Is it's literally people suffering from a psychotic break, and that psychotic break is a separation from the internal and the external. So that comes about by being basically like gaslit, so believing an actor is their character, or multiple actors are their characters, believing in sort of these psyops, we'll call them. And then that's exact, like the digital media kind of throws fuel on the fire, because nobody's getting their information or their opinion about the world based off of their firsthand experience. They're getting it based off of the screen. And then not only that, is that there's like if the person has any sort of deception in their own life, any sort of judgment in their own life, that makes their heart disassociate. So then they're only operating from the ego, the false heart, the external heart. So their personality cannot make any good decisions. Like if a person is pure in their own life, non-judgmental in their own life, in their own heart, then all of this other mental shenanigans doesn't, like, none of this works on the true heart. So like mental psychosis does not overwhelm the true heart, and I don't think physical psychosis overwhelms the true heart. It's like it's only when people make those when they damage themselves on the personal level through lying, deception, judgment, and things of that nature, that makes them vulnerable to psychological and metabolic pathologies, because it's the heart just knows directly. So it's only once you've disassociated into the ego, which does not know. So since the ego does not know and does not have, it can get involved in consumption / addictive behavior, or psychologically aberrant behavior like schizophrenia or totalitarian stuff. And at that point, it's like the person is in a video game inside of their own head rather than in reality. So it's like the totalitarian stuff is like genuinely as psychotic as full-blown homeless person schizophrenia, but it looks more elegant. It's hyper persuasive because it's created by gaslighting, it's created by false narrative, it's created by inauthentic personalities, and so it is in itself a very forceful, inauthentic personality. So it's incredibly psychopathic because it's incredibly inauthentic at its core, because it's the spawn of inauthenticity. It's the spawn of lies. Like somebody intentionally lies, and then if somebody's heart is vulnerable to lies, it sort of creates it creates another psychopath, like a vampire. And so it's like people might have been okay, but it's like you get bit by a false narrative, and you're because you're egoic, the false narrative sinks in, and you become psychopathic inadvertently. Similar to like how if you get bit by a vampire, you just become a vampire. It's kind of like out of your control. You granted you let yourself become an ego. You let your heart disassociate from the situation. There was that choice, but once that choice was made, then the consequence of that choice is to be prey to evil and thus become evil. And I think that's kind of what's going on in the world right now.